out into sexual violence, and only female victims seem to be recognized. The overall impact of this gender gap and marginalization cannot be overemphasized, bearing in mind that sexual violence would have been perpetrated against men and boys in all cultures, geographic regions, times, and periods. According to Chris Dolan, sexual and gender-based violence is a marked feature of many of the recent and ongoing conflicts in Africa. Despite the growing number of male rape victims, we are still largely ignorant. We're still ignorant about the actual scope or nature of sexual violence perpetrated against men and boys. We lack knowledge of the psychosocial consequences of sexual violence for male survivors. We're not aware of the many roles that sexual violence against the male gender could play in the perpetuation of more violence, including armed conflicts or retaliatory sexual violence. We're not sure if untreated, sexual violence against the male gender leads to domestic violence, increased sexual violence against men and boys in our society, and other acts of violence against women and children, sexual violence against refugees, child soldiers, and internally displaced persons, both during and after conflicts. While the silence surrounding the issue of sexual violence against women has been broken in most parts of the world, it's quite unfortunate to admit that the issue of sexual violence against the male gender, effective legislation, access to justice and redress are still not considered, acknowledged, or applied, thus limiting the access of male victims to legal justice. Bearing in mind that sexual violence not treated begets trauma, and trauma not treated begets violence, begets conflict and violence in the society, it is our expectation that by the end of this symposium, we would have succeeded in breaking the silence surrounding sexual violence against the male gender and suggesting effective measures of justice or redress that would be applied to better protect male victims of sexual violence in international and domestic jurisdictions. I wish us all very happy deliberations. Thank you.
It's my pleasure now to ask Judge Kofi Kumelio-Fande and assisted by Barrister Tanya Zenze to make some awards to volunteers for the International Peace Campaign, and so that we can celebrate the kind of people who make these kinds of events and other events like this possible.
Contrary to what has always been said or believed, award winning is not a celebration, it is a challenge. Then they will be confronted with two kinds of attitudes, which is, what is the meaning they will be giving to the award which will be given to them this afternoon? There are two ways to go about it. One is to look at them as a retrospective object rewarding the achievement as of today. Whether it helps, I don't know. The other one is to look to see in this object a prospective sign as a kind of recognition of abilities to do more than what has been done to deserve them. Meaning the work is ahead, and what is being celebrated for this is just the beginning.
Thank you, Judge Afande. Good afternoon, everyone. Just to give a quick background as to how this has come about. Last year, we organized a campaign for peace in commemoration of the UN Day for Peace, and we did this together with the Platform for Peace and Humanity. And during that campaign, we had a lot of assistance from many volunteers across the world. It was an online campaign, And lots of them gave their time, their energy, and everything into this campaign, and we had a very successful campaign last year. It is for this reason that we thought we should appreciate these young people and encourage them, because the efforts we are engaged in will not go anywhere if we do not have volunteers. So we are going to present the award to 4 of those who are here. Irusota, the Center for African Justice and Peace. Thank you very much. Thank you, Una. And then Uche, we hope you continue to give us your time. Thank you very much. She's the board chairman of the center, and she has been working tirelessly to put all this together and to launch all the campaigns we have been involved in. So I don't know if you have a word or two.
Thank you very much. I think that I'm not on the program to say anything at this time, but I want to say a big thank you to all the volunteers that participated in the peace campaign. You know, for me, I was challenged because I know that I can only speak English and people can understand. Thank you very much.
Well, just a little bit of information about Faustin. He was 13 or 14 at the time of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Most of his family members were killed, only he survived with his brother. His property was taken and he was also raped during the genocide by a woman. In 2008 he accepted, or he actually asked to have his testimonial included in this book, The Man Who Killed Me. It includes 17 testimonials, 16 women and 1 man. And it also includes photos of most of the people, because they really wanted to have their story out there. Even though, as you see today, it's not that easy yet to talk to an international prize as we are. But Faustin has been really an example in Rwanda, within his community, because he's one of the very few men in Rwanda who talked about it. And after he did so, he inspired so many other men to talk about it as well. A small part of his story about the rape that he endured. So his name is Faustin Kaliura, and he was born in August 1918. He says, "I don't know of any other men who experienced sexual violence during the genocide, but I know they wouldn't talk about it if they had. It was a very difficult experience, and not all men are brave enough to talk about it. It's considered shameful to be raped by a woman. I first spoke about it only in 2007. I don't want Hutu to hear about this because I don't want to give them the satisfaction. They may ridicule me. I can only share this with other survivors of the genocide." So about 1 week in the genocide, he was running and hiding. A Hutu woman found me and took me to her house. The woman locked me in her house. I was only 13, and the horrors I experienced in her house were more than I could endure. She forced me to have sex with her. She raped me 3 times a day for 3 days. She made me lie on the floor, and because I did not have any experience with sex, she instructed me on how to do it. She would stroke my penis up and down with her hands first. Because I was still young, I had a hard penis fairly quickly, and then she would force my penis into her vagina. Sometimes she forced me to go on top of her, and sometimes she went on top of me. She was much stronger than I was, and since I was afraid, I did everything she told me to do. She also threatened me, saying that she would call the Interlanden if I did not cooperate, and that they would surely kill me. I don't know why she did this to a young boy like me, but she didn't have a husband, and it seems she saw me as her husband. It was pure cruelty, especially considering my young age. It seems unbelievable, but it's true. I don't have the words to describe what I was living in those days, but I know that I don't wish it for anyone else, not even my worst enemy. His answer to the question, have you been able to overcome this? And if yes, how? He says, well, constant counseling and prayer helped me. With spiritual and physical support, I regained strength. Encountering with other people who we share the same faith in group counseling also helped me a lot to feel much better. And why do you think male victims of sexual violence suffer in silence without reporting or speaking about their situation? And if there are other male victims of rape listening now, why do you think it's important for them to break the silence, to talk like you did? He says, well, male victims of sexual violence suffer in silence because they are men and think that testifying about it will take off their dignity. Yes, they should speak out because otherwise they suffer in silence and this may cause post-traumatic disorders. Another thing is that the world should be aware of the genocide and sexual violence for male victims. So these are his words, and thank you for having me.
So what do you think is that factors in which prevent the victims from speaking up, and how can we change that kind of mindset for people?
Need to be strong and need to be in control and need to provide security for the women. So if you are attacked in a sexual manner, then that is taken away from you. But I think the most important, well, the way to change that and to tackle this is to talk about it like we are doing today.
I concur with what she has said, and I do appreciate the questions which are asked. One element which I want to add to that is beyond the cultural elements, which can be regional, there is also what I can call the universal perception of that. We are talking about this only from the year 2002 and onward, meaning before that, no one was believing that it could have happened. Then, it is a kind of burden on a man today to expose himself to that critical perception where some continue doubting about that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'll make some brief remarks, and my remarks will touch on the elements of an act. Asking for too much.
If I may, I will.
Okay. My remarks will touch on the elements of an access to justice-based approach to addressing sexual violence generally, or sexual violence against men, since that is the topic. My brief presentation will focus on 1, some history on how sexual violence crimes became incorporated into international criminal law. 2, the initiatives at the International Criminal Court in dealing with sexual and gender-based violence cases. 3, the challenges to end impunity faced by the International Criminal Court. Now, just to remind ourselves, how did sexual violence came on board the platform of international law? Just very briefly. This is the way I understand it. This is important because before, the prosecution of gender-based crimes was unsatisfactory and in some cases non-existent. The Nuremberg trials in 1945 of prominent Nazis, the Tokyo trials in 1946 are cases in point. No rape charges were brought at these 2 trials despite mass rapes having been committed. It is through case law, or what I would call judgment law, that has brought into focus gender-based violence in international law. Now, at the International Criminal Court, the ICC, the first conviction in the history of the case came on the 21st of March 2016. The first rape conviction, when 3 judges, including myself, convicted Sajin Pierre Gombo for rape as a war crime and a crime against humanity. These crimes were committed in the Central African Republic by a contingent of troops that Mr. Bemba had effective authority and control over. Mr. Bemba did not commit these crimes himself as such. This is what was so interesting about this case. But rather, he was convicted for failing to exercise control properly over his forces, i.e. human responsibility. In particular, Mr. Bemba was held responsible for the rape of one man in addition to many men and girls, many women and girls. But this particular witness stands in my, I still can see him when I think about this matter. On the same day, this man's wife, daughters and granddaughter were attacked. 3 men, 3 armed soldiers forcefully. He explained to us in details. He was actually gang raped. He was a man aged 60 plus, and he was gang raped. And he described his attackers as young and energetic men. Now, he explained and described to us how 3 of them were inserted their penises in his mouth, and at the same time, 3 in his anus. Now, I remember him telling us that he doesn't know how long it went on, but he passed on. He passed on. He couldn't remember what else happened. And the situation was so bad in that during that period of 6 months in the Central African Republic, there was complete, nothing was going on. So despite all what he went through or what he suffered, he simply used herbs because there was no medical facility that he could go to. But we appreciated him in the sense that he was a witness, he was a man, he was able to come to court and give us very, very fine details. Now, after these events, he could not walk and he was only treated with traditional herbs, traditional leaves, as he explained. This man testified that people in his community disrespected him and that he considered himself a dead man. He said, I'm here, judges, I'm walking, but basically I'm a dead man. So in conclusion, and notwithstanding the existence of the Rome Statute, there is still evidence that gender-based violence is being used as a weapon of war in many conflicts. Just when you look at the screen of the TV today, you can see it for yourself. You don't need to read about it, you can just watch it. So there is still a lot of work to be done. So I call upon states to ratify the Rome Statute and make it part of their national laws and thereby domesticate it. In this way, we can all be part of a joint and universal effort to fight impunity. And impunities include what we are talking about today, sexual and gender-based violence, the male perspective, the female perspective, and generally everybody's perspective. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to be here, and of course I'm grateful to have been requested to make a contribution to this very important topic. Of course, here and there in my presentation, you will of course see the references to Uganda and maybe to the African continent. I would like to say on the international conference, for instance, on the Great Lakes region, in 2006, there was a protocol on prevention and suppression of sexual violence against women and children. And it defines any act of violence, sexual violence, as any act which violates the sexual autonomy and bodily integrity of women and children under international law. Sexual violence takes place in homes, in the community, and even in schools. It is also important to note that sexual violence also includes violence perpetrated against men and boys. And what I would like to discuss is, of course, the legal provisions for sexual violence against the male gender in Uganda criminal law and the existing stereotypical ideologies affecting male victims. Uganda has adopted a zero-tolerance stance against the vice of sexual violence in several legislations. And indeed, at the national level, Chapter 4 of the 1995 Constitution of Uganda emphasizes respect for human rights and prohibits any form of discrimination on the grounds of gender, sex, age, and religious belonging, among others. Thus, it recognizes that every person is equal before the law. But in Uganda, defilement cases form the bulk of the cases handled by our chief magistrates, but more than 99% of those cases under this category have female victims. Yeah? Cases involving male victims are very minimal, and the reasons, of course, could be that they are not reported for fear of being scorned. I'll come back to that because I think in Africa and maybe other parts of the world, this is still a very, very big obstacle. Yes, again, I would like to say the case law on sexual harassment, it has become rampant in places of work and schools, especially in institutions of higher learning. Much as it is females that complain about this vice, and the law protects both. But again, men who are harassed by female teachers and female bosses fear to report due to the cultural belief and thinking that man cannot be sexually harassed. So the challenges to successful investigation and prosecution of sexual violence against men. Of course, Honorable Judge Al-Watch already indicated the links to the ICC and case law. I think we are all in agreement, and what I'm telling you is really nothing new, I'm afraid, but there are the cultural aspects. Men are perceived to be this strong and incapable of being victimized in this way. During only a few decennia, the sexual violence against women, especially as a weapon of war, has been recognized. And women have been coming out to testify, fortunately. However, we still have a long way to go, especially where it concerns the male perspective. But I must admit that even though the victims don't come forward, we also have a lack of facilities for forensic evidence. Really, there's more to it than we can do now. In conclusion, sorry, taken too long maybe. Broadly speaking, both international and national legislations have developed in ways that often exclude, whether implicitly or explicitly, man as a class of victim of sexual violence. Although Uganda has domesticated the Rome Statute in 2010, we are still lacking enforcement, which is largely due to the cultural aspects, not only in Uganda, but throughout Africa. In fact, there's no legal instrument, either international or national, that is directed principally at outlawing sexual violence against men. On the contrary, all legal frameworks outlaw sexual violence against women and girls. For example, where there's a law in Uganda that outlaws female genital mutilation, there is no corresponding law that outlaws forced male circumcision, which was prevalent in the Kenya case. I don't think Honorable Judge already mentioned it before the ICC. This exemplifies the prevailing belief that it's only women who can be victims of sexual violence. All acts of sexual violence violate basic human rights, irrespective of who they are committed against or under what circumstances they are committed. Sexual violence against women has been widely researched and documented, whereas sexual violence against men has garnered increasing publicity in recent years. It still remains extremely under-researched and under-reported. We have a long way to go, but with concerted efforts and brainstorming at fora such as this one, especially if we take them closer to where we want to see the change, which means not only in The Hague, we are making some headway, but we have to go much further in the near future. So I thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions maybe later on. Thank you very much.
And thank you also for having organised this event today, because this is an issue that I have had an interest in for years now, and it's something that's only just beginning to get the attention that it deserves and to be treated seriously as an actual phenomenon. And the first thing that I want to highlight is the way in which acts of sexual violence against men have been characterised legally. Because I think it's very telling. It's not necessarily an accident that it's been viewed primarily through this lens. So It was mentioned earlier that this was something that was addressed at the ICTY. And the ICTY prosecuted a number of cases involving male victims of sexual violence, especially in a detention context. So a number of the ICTY cases dealt with concentration camp type situations, detention camps. And there were a number of different forms of sexual violence that were routinely committed against men in those camp situations. You would have situations of forcible nudity, forced masturbation, genital torture, as in beatings of the genitals, or some of the acts that Ambassador Black was describing, forced sexual contact between male detainees as a means of humiliating both of them. So forcible masturbation, forced fellatio. But partially because of the legal context that that tribunal was operating in and the type of crimes they had available to them. And that's something I'll discuss more in a minute. Those acts, even though the evidence was brought forward and the victims testified and the information itself was sort of publicized, they were legally characterized as forms of torture or outrages on personal dignity or other inhumane acts or cruel and inhuman treatment, not as explicitly acts of rape or sexual violence. And the difference, for those of you that aren't that familiar with the Rome Statute, the difference between those two things is that other forms of sexual violence involves an act of a sexual nature, whereas other inhumane acts involves the intentional infliction of severe pain or suffering. And I think that's because of a fundamental misunderstanding of what sexual violence is. It's not just sexual acts committed without consent. It's not just acts committed for a sexual motive or for someone's sexual gratification. It also, in a number of domestic jurisdictions, includes acts that target a person's sexual function or their sexual identity. And that's an element that I think hasn't been fully exploited in the jurisprudence of the international tribunals and the ICC in particular. And that leads me on to my second point about the definition of sexual crimes at the international level compared to the domestic level. Now, at the ICTY, part of the reason why you had these crimes charged as torture or other inhumane acts or other types of crimes was because the definition of rape as a crime wasn't clear. It wasn't explicitly enumerated anywhere. It was something that was developed over time by the judges. So I can understand in a scenario where you're the prosecutor in 1993 or 1994 and you're putting an indictment together, there's no jurisprudence for you to go on. And if you look at domestic jurisdictions, a lot of them don't include, let's say, forcible oral sex or forcible anal sex in the definition of the crime of rape specifically. Think of the chilling effect that that has on someone and the likelihood it is that they'll actually come forward. And this leads me to the third point, the gender dynamics in the cultures that we're looking at. And they're not specific, they are universal. They have a huge impact not only on the consequences for the victim and their view of themselves, they actually have an impact on the likelihood that sexual violence will take place in the first place. And there's something profoundly depressing about the idea that the worst thing you can do to a man in an armed conflict is to treat him like a woman. I mean, there's layers of wrongness to that we can't even begin to scratch here. But the important thing is, the more we talk about it, the more we label it for what it is, the more we point out examples of it and call them sexual crimes, the less the likelihood that somebody who's been a victim of it will think they were the only one this has ever happened to. The lower the likelihood that someone who's investigating it will overlook it because they presume men are perpetrators and women are victims. And the lower the likelihood that someone who's prosecuting it will fail to recognize the centrality of the sexual component of the violence rather than just focusing on the violence itself. So I could happily keep going for the rest of the time, but I will leave it at that. Thank you.
I would like to welcome the initiative of this African Center for Justice, Peace and Human Rights And by the way, I'm also Vice President of the Assembly of State Parties to the Statute of Rome since December last year, the ICC. So, yeah, I can also use that capacity to speak here.
Yes, my brother. That's why you're invited.
Commonly, gender-based violence refers exclusively to the suffering inflicted on girls and women by male individuals. Without minimizing this violence, it is necessary today, in order to reinforce the relevance of the gender approach, to examine how and why the problem can be posed in men's side. Violence against men exists in a situation of peace, but also in a situation of conflict. We have heard some wonderful and very touching description. I had to really retain my tears. In a situation of peace too, we have pedophilia, which targets boys most often in many countries. We have some accounts of pedophilia. It is a violent sexual assault, and more frequent, all being difficult to detect in the context of social relations and domestic life. I think it was Miriam, Ambassador So, who described perfectly the African mindset when it comes to sexual violence. It is only in recent years that some women NGOs have been doing a wonderful job in raising awareness and sensitizing them, asking them to come forward and talk about it. Because it's a big shame for us Africans to talk about those intimate relations, especially when they are violent and not wanted. According to lawyer Lara Stemple, the gender approach has led international relief and human rights NGOs, as well as UN agencies, to favor an approach focused on sexual violence against women, focused on this, legitimizing thus a hierarchy of these abuses by locating the adult men who are victims at the bottom of this hierarchy. So I will not comment on it. But your initiative helps to mitigate these risks. It reinforces us in the belief that respect for human rights with its corollaries remains a universal principle, but also a value for which we must fight without reservation and without any discrimination. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you all.
You're going in your own countries on that issue. Do we now need a campaign worldwide on male sexual violence? I don't know if any of you would like to pick that up.
Well, one thing that I noticed is UN Women had, as part of one of their campaigns in relation to female sexual violence, for female victims. But it completely overlooked the fact that it's not a gender-specific issue. And the ambassador made a very good point when he said gender-based violence to most people means violence against women committed by men. And it's ironic that probably the best thing you could do to advance the cause of sexual violence against women and men is to make it a gender-neutral issue.
Like I've also highlighted when I was speaking about cultural aspects, we have even as women not caught up in the world about being emancipated, having the same pay, having the same rights, having the same. So we are still catching up. So I think that's also why it's one of the impediments to actually now bring in the male perspective, because they say we women, we haven't achieved where we want to go. But I think if we want to achieve it in our cultural contexts and traditions in Africa, we need a lot more time. Because there we are still much behind, and if I may use the words of my president, backwards. Yeah, they use the word backwards in terms of the emancipation of women in Africa in general. It will take a long time. Generally, we have explained it. The men are the most powerful. The men are Yeah, the protectors, and when you don't put those two yet at equal level, I think you will not have won that war to also recognize that GBV against man is of equal importance. So it's a cultural aspect which will take a generation. And just to mention something about female genital mutilation in Uganda, we have a law against it. We knew that in the eastern part of Uganda, it takes place every year. We caught the women with their dirty knives who had just come from a ceremony whereby I don't know how many girls, young girls, had again been mutilated. We arrested them. The police went, arrested the women. And they were in jail, waiting for an investigation to start, and no victim came forward. You see, so it just means that we as a government, we can have the laws in place. But if our population is not ready to change that cultural practice, we can have laws which cannot be enforced. And it's the same with, with the male perspective on GBV. Thank you so much.
And I'm really interested in your opinions on the role of the international community in framing conflicts. So not only in a gender way, but I also understand that the way we frame conflicts as an international community is often good versus evil. So it's who is the good guy and who is the evil guy, who's the enemy. So in the case of Uganda, and I know that, I think in the ICC court there was no trials against government forces, only LRA forces. And so what happens to these male victims who are just left aside? Their enemy isn't recognised as the enemy. So what can we do as an international community to kind of help that situation? What's our role in kind of presenting conflicts?
When we were confronted with, of course, mainly NGOs that said, oh, but the government forces, they need to be also investigated because they have to be blamed for certain matters and incidents that happened. I can only say that we presented a book of about 300 pages to the court, because for us, if you steal as a soldier a chicken from a civilian, you can go to prison for, I think, a year. If you are a civilian stealing a chicken from a civilian, well, it may never actually end into a court, but as a soldier is under such strict code of conduct that is only being dealt with by the marshal, the court martial. That is why we had to give to the court, to the ICC, a book of about 300 pages of all the case law that the court martial had actually judged soldiers by in the conflict zone in the period of, I think, 2002 to 2005. So that is the reason, I think, why the court hasn't moved, because that is complementarity. We do treat, our perpetrators, and there were perpetrators, no doubt about it. I know about that. But we were dealing with them at court-martial level, at national level.
The gender component of armed conflict is massive, and we're decades away from acknowledging it for what it is. The question of what constitutes gender-based violence, I see this all the time in doing trainings and even in reading about this. If there's an attack on a village and all the women are raped and all the men are killed, only what's done to the women will be seen as gender-based. So gender-based violence is not only a shorthand for violence against women, it's a euphemism for sexual violence. But in actual fact, one of the most profound examples of a gender-based crime at any of the tribunals was the prosecution for genocide at Srebrenica, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were separated from the women and the children and killed not only on the basis that they were Muslim, but because they were men and boys.
Why the term gender violence is always associated with females according to United Nations?
According to the United Nations. You are women.
I'm not the boss of you and women. I think it's partially a kind of a language thing, because it's a shorthand for so long. People used to talk about sexual violence, and then it became sexual and gender-based violence, and then it became SGBV, and then that got subsumed into GBV and VAW, which is violence against women. Every act of sexual violence is gender-based, but not every act of gender-based violence is sexual. And I actually think the likelihood is that people will realize it's not necessarily helping to clarify anything or to deepen people's understanding to lump them in together, because they're not synonymous. So what we might have is a move away from coupling gender-based violence always with sexual violence, or coupling gender-based violence always with violence against women. Because it's reductive, and it's unhelpful, and it actually sets things back quite a bit. But God knows where it came from in the first place.
We actually have these posters, and the idea is we want to go beyond this hall in this advocacy. We want to reach out to the world. So the posters are meant for us to hold, and then we take pictures. But we need to let you know that these pictures will be presented on social media. It could even come out in the newspaper. So if we do have your consent for that, and you actually believe in what we're doing, and you have this positivity in your mind, you could join us, and then we do it collectively together. We're promoting development and reducing the problem in the world. Thank you.
So I will be speaking on the need for international courts to influence legal developments on gender issues in domestic jurisdictions. Quite a mouthful. I thought I would try and give you a roadmap of what I want to do. I would first want to speak about, of course, complementarity, how it applies here. Perhaps explore the sort of the symbiotic relationship that exists between the international courts and the domestic courts. Look at how the international courts can influence the domestic courts, and perhaps highlight that ultimately the flow ought not to be a unilateral flow from the international courts to the domestic courts, but it should be one that recognizes the symbiotic relationship. So international tribunals and courts are often characterized by the adoption of a hybrid procedural or substantive legal regime. The creation of such regimes constitutes both, of course, an acknowledgement and an expansion of the global legal developments that preceded their establishment. It also functions as a fundamental, ongoing dialogue between the domestic on the one hand and international jurisdictions on the other. It is their interaction within the ideal of a systemic global justice that national, and in my view, international systems of justice seek to strengthen each other, recognizing common goals and the imperative need for cooperating and cooperation between the two.
Sexual violence is any sexual act or attempt to obtain the sexual act by violence or coercion. It acts to traffic a person or acts directed against a person's sexuality, regardless of the relationship to the victim. It is widespread and it is considered one of the most traumatic, pervasive, and common rights violations. Sexual violence against men and boys is alarmingly common and takes a rapidly consistent form across contexts in terms of how it affects victims and societies as a human rights violation that is unfortunately taboo to talk about, like most of the speakers have said. It has been committed in all cultures, geographic regions, and time periods. Today, while some of the silence surrounding the issue of sexual violence against women is being broken, unfortunately, effective measures of justice and redress are still not understood or applied in ways that can support male victims. The Violence Against Persons Act, Prohibition Act, was passed by the National Assembly of Nigeria, meaning it is applicable in the Federal Capital Territory. So it is my hope that perhaps very soon this legislation will be tested, but there are divergent views currently that it ought to only be applicable in the Federal Capital Territory, which is a very small part of Nigeria, really. So it's hopeful, we're hopeful that perhaps it will be tested and then it can be made applicable by judicial pronouncements all over the Federation. Or perhaps the states can be encouraged to pass this law in their states so that there's no ambiguity. Everyone knows that this is applicable. And then we can be sure then that we've evened out the scale in Nigeria and that men and women can equally be guilty of rape. Thank you very much.
If you look then at the forms of the sexual violence, I've put here a number of numbers. It is just also for you to realize when somebody experiences sexual violence, actually how bad it is. To be honest, when I was looking at the literature, I sometimes had to just put the papers away because you get really horrified by what is happening. Interesting, the issue in Iraq was that the women, because their men were not functioning, their men were withdrawn, their men didn't want sex. So they came and said, hey, health workers, relief workers, please help us, help our men. And then there was in the end it was decided to integrate the services for women as well as men. There was a systematic review by someone in 2013. So what is important is survival care, livelihood initiatives, people can work again, community mobilization, helping the community to understand what it means for people and less stigmatization thereby. Personnel initiatives, making sure that WHO, UN or whatever personnel doesn't engage in it. In more conflict situation, up to 40%. Perpetrators, classical dichotomy thought. We tend to want to classify men, women. But the gender movement, the transgender movement, the gay movement have shown, hey, we have this long abbreviation, the LGBTIQK, I don't remember it all, but it has shown that there are many more differences between people. Intersex, transgender, there's everything. So why dichotomize?
I think that what would be more interesting is the fact now that you have things are no longer just male or female, you have transgender. And the statute does not address that situation. And of course, to reopen those very difficult negotiations is an issue. And depending on how you take it, this is another issue. I have two of my colleagues here, but there may be some who might be judicial activists who might give it a very expansive interpretation, or you may have some who treat it as a treaty which creates criminal law liability, and as a treaty it should be interpreted strictly. And so that on one view, you might not be able to recognize some of those situations. On another, you may. So it depends.
I think in the Nigerian situation, well, I was rushing through the paper, so part of what I skipped out was to say that the act came about after concerted pressure by civil society. Nigeria has a very, very vibrant civil society, and they put concerted pressure on the government on this issue, and amongst many other issues too. So civil society, participation and pressure by civil society helps greatly in this regard. In societies where there is a vibrant civil society, they can push the legislature to do absolutely anything. So it's hopeful that where for countries who don't have this yet, their civil society can take up the gauntlet and help to push them in their government in that regard.
I wanted to find out your views about what are the thoughts that national governments should, how should they seek to find the resources to be able to now make this legislation that is the ideal to be able to actually now put it in practice.
I was thinking to see if they can explain or if they have a view on the relationship between the intensive interest which has been put on sexual violence against women and the lack of attention to men.
There have been increasing cases of boys in high school, maybe 15, and their teachers are raping them because it's statutory rape, right? Their teachers are maybe 24, 25, 26 are raping them. But then the boys don't even report it. Actually, the story really comes out when they are bragging about their conquests, in quotes. And then so it's more a societal thing. And sometimes even the men themselves do not realize that this is rape. And even when they do, trust me, I would for one wouldn't come out to say I've been raped if I were. Right? It's society tends to look down on men when that happens.
I wonder, people always say, there's an increase of sexual violence. Is it really an increase? Or is there an increase in reporting? And was it already there, but people didn't come forward?
What I've been observing is we're talking about males and men, but what is intersectionality with black males? Because I can imagine that the societal burden that is being put on black males might have also a different outcome. And then also to Mr. Henderson, how are judges and lawyers at the ICC also aware of the potential burden that black males experience, and how are they aware of anti-black racism? So my question is basically, what about black men?
Yeah, I forgot maybe to mention that most of my data from the studies that I read are from Africa, because that was the focus of the conference there. However, if you look around the globe, in terms of male sexual violence, as we discussed earlier, it happens everywhere, in every culture. If you then look at the interventions, there is much done, but not really clear research which really shows that there is impact, except for a lot of studies in US schools, where they did large studies, awareness raising, counseling, and there it had a positive impact lasting about up to 4 years when they measured it in terms of reduction of sexual violence against men as well as against women.
In terms of finances, I think our sister said something about how easy is it to get to finances to be able to raise the awareness about this thing we were talking about. How do we get people to know that this is real?
More awareness needs to be created on sexual violence against males, because with more awareness you will get more support for victims, and there will be more, when more awareness is created about the offense. Of course, people will start to know how to prevent such situations.
Thank you for shelving your tight schedules to come here tonight. These are very busy people. And I know that whatever they might have prepared to present tonight would have been useless without the audience. It's a very wonderful speaker. You should continue speaking.
It's excellent. This is a topic which really needs more research and more understanding.
It's important that this issue is now brought on the agenda.
What do you think has happened here today?
Well, it's been a symposium. It's now that the awareness is coming and the place I can say a milestone.
It was quite an enlightening program. It was good, well attended, very, very informative, because prior to this time, everybody always talks about violence against women. So this is actually the first time I'm hearing people talk about violence against men.
Oh, I'm supposed to look, okay.
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 How good evening, ma'am.
Hello.
Can you tell us your name?
My name is Naimh Hayes.
My name is Miracle. I think that this is a journey. I don't think that you can say that we've achieved something very, very specific out of this, apart from help to put it further on the agenda.
And what do you think this seminar has been able to achieve tonight?
Oh, it's achieved a huge amount just by having the conversation in the first place.
You have judges talking, you have ambassadors talking. Wow.
Because I've been attending events like this for the last 12 years, and this is only the third event that has dealt directly with the issue of sexual and gender-based violence against men.